Hello, I'm Bernard Hickey from interest.co.nz and welcome to a special report on our electoral process in the financial crisis we're seeing right now. We have a problem. We are having a financial and economic crisis at the same time as an election campaign. You only have to think back to 1984 to see what a combustible and dangerous mix that can be. Back in 1984, then Prime Minister Robert Muldoon refused to listen to advice from his Treasury and from the Reserve Bank about the need for a devaluation in the New Zealand dollar. Essentially, New Zealand almost went bankrupt in the space of the two or three last weeks of that 1984 election campaign. At that stage, most people expected the government to change. David Lange and Roger Douglas were about to come in. In fact, they had suggested we needed a devaluation, and that sparked a run on the currency. In part too, because the government had borrowed heavily offshore and we were running a heavy current account deficit. All this meant that on election night, Robert Muldoon refused to give up power, and then we had a constitutional crisis. It was a disaster for New Zealand and we almost went bankrupt. Fast forward 24 years and we have some ominously similar situations. Right now we have a Prime Minister, Helen Clark, who is pretty much running the country by herself. She's running financial and economic policy. She was the one who announced the Deposit Guarantee Scheme last Sunday after a discussion with the Australian Prime Minister Kevin Rudd. She told her Treasury and the Reserve Bank to simply announce the scheme. They have opposed, particularly the Reserve Bank, the announcement of a deposit guarantee scheme for decades. And they had to come up with something in less than 5 hours. We then had an opposition who were not briefed on this and were out in the dark on what is essentially the biggest piece of economic policy and financial policy announced in decades in New Zealand. It has completely changed the financial landscape, and our opposition, who may be in government within 3 weeks, had no idea what was happening. The government under Helen Clark chose to make this a political issue by painting the opposition as out of touch and behind the curve, because she had refused to allow Treasury and the Reserve Bank to brief them. We now have a situation where it's quite possible within 3 weeks we don't know who's in charge. The coalition negotiations could go on for another 6 weeks. Yet we need a deposit guarantee scheme that includes a wholesale guarantee on deposits. If we don't have that, there is a risk of a silent run on our banks. There is a risk that by Christmas our banks may not be able to lend to each other. This is a financial crisis that needs to be dealt with by our political and economic leaders. We need Parliament to be recalled to debate a proper deposit guarantee scheme, not something that's passed through with the emergency powers of the Public Finance Act. We need a proper public debate on this huge piece of economic and financial policy which our politicians are about to commit us to. We could have the government guaranteeing $450 billion worth of deposits, nearly 3 times our GDP, and we may not have had a decent public debate on it. The new Prime Minister of the country may not have an idea what this policy is, and most of the parliamentarians will not have a say in how it's going to be imposed. This all in the middle of an election campaign that could turn, and in fact in many cases has already turned ugly in a very partisan way. We have the Prime Minister, for example, calling John Key a politician on training wheels. She says she doesn't trust him and that the nation shouldn't trust him. Yet they're supposed to be running the country for the next 3 to 6 weeks during a period of financial and economic crisis. This is not on. If we're going to have a democracy, we should use Parliament to pass these rules. I'm Bernard Hickey with a special call for the recall of Parliament and a debate about the Deposit Guarantee Scheme and any other economic measures needed to deal with this crisis. I'm Bernard Hickey for interest.co.nz.